going through 2 years of the revolution in Egypt. And when I first received the invitation from Bishara to be here in the spring semester, I was quite honestly relieved and happy that maybe I can get a break out of Egypt for a couple of months here. The end result, of course, is that since I got here, I became far more obsessed with Twitter, Facebook, following the news in Egypt, infinitely more than I was in Cairo. But nonetheless, it's been an amazing time, and I would like to thank Brown, Barbara, Bashara, and Ellen for all their help. I'm going to start with an episode from 1954. Then move on to give you the two main questions that I'm trying to address here, and hopefully end within 20 minutes. In my training, I was told that as a graduate student, no one should ever speak more than 20 minutes on a talk. Otherwise, you honestly risk losing the attention of the audience, and I'll leave it if there is questions for the remainder of the talk. So, in the summer of 1954, 27 July 1954, demonstrations took over Cairo. This was barely 2 years after the military coup of 1952, which led to the emergence of what has become known as the July regime, or the system that has ruled Egypt for the last 60 years, and which, if you're following demonstrations in Cairo over the January 52 revolution, the usual slogan of the people want to bring the system down, or الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The reference to the nizam or regime is the 52 regime that emerged in July 52. So 2 years after the military coup, in the 27th of July 1954, demonstrations took all over Cairo, and the chantings were very peculiar. The chantings were demanding the downfall of the constitution, the downfall of political parties, the downfall of liberalism, the downfall of democracy, the downfall of labor unions, and so on. Basically, the downfall of all the liberal units that we take as structuring our civil society. These demonstrations eventually arrived at Majlis al-Dawla, or the Conseil d'Etat, which is the administrative court of Egypt, and which today plays a pivotal role. If anyone is following the revolution news in Cairo now, it plays a pivotal role in dealing with claims and counterclaims following the January 25 revolution. The demonstrations reached the Conseil d'Etat, and the slogans chanting "down with democracy, down with liberalism" escalated to include "down with Senhouri." Senhouri is, as some of you might know, the most eminent Egyptian jurist, the most eminent Arab jurist, actually, if we must grandiose Egypt as usual to include the entire region. He is a jurist who wrote the 24-volume tome on the Egyptian Civil Code, was a minister of education, and at the end of his administrative career became the head of the newly established Conseil d'Etat, or administrative courts. The building in which this is our dear friend Senhouri, whose story we're about to hear. The building in which the Conseil is located, which is this picture, is on the Nile in Giza. The gates of the building were closed by metal chains in order to stop the demonstrators from coming in. A police officer walked into the building, demanded to meet Senhouri, pleaded with Senhouri to please step out and speak with the demonstrators and appease them. Senhouri acquiesced, stepped out, and after that ensued what is one of the most celebrated folkloric stories in our legal history. In Arabic, it's called قصة ضرب الصنهوري بالجزمة على سلم مجلس الدولة, which has a rhyme to it. In English, that would be the story of beating up Senhouri with a shoe on the steps of the Conseil d'Etat. Basically, Senhouri stepped out to speak to the demonstrators and appease them. Demonstrators proceeded to beat up Senhouri. One of the, what we would call in Arabic, office boys, which is not a terribly nice word, but one of the Farashin, or office boys, acted heroically. He actually received the blow that was intended for Senhouri, which apparently was a Remington typewriter from the 50s, which is a heavy machine. If you want to beat someone up, you could definitely kill them with one. Senhouri was barely injured, then covered up in a carpet from the Majlis, and swiftly taken to the hospital. The next day, from his hospital bed, Senhouri officially accused Nasser, the head of the military coup that took place barely 2 years before. He officially accused Nasser of preparing the attack against him. Nasser came to visit him at the hospital. Senhouri refused to meet him, instructed his wife, Senhouri's wife, to refuse admission to Nasser. And then when the prosecution came, as I said, he formally lodged the report against Nasser. And that was the end of that. Senhouri was then removed from his position as the head of Majlis al-Dawla. He was put under house arrest. He was denied travel outside of Egypt for 10 years. Due to that, we owe the good fortune that Senhouri finally sat down at his desk and wrote that huge tome of commentary on the Civil Code. So we have Nasser to thank for Senhouri's house arrest. But also with that ended the independence of Majlis al-Dawla or the Conseil d'Etat. So this moment in 1954 in our legal history is typically called the first massacre of the judiciary. And I'm going to be using this term a couple of times, the massacre of the judiciary, until we get to 2012, bearing in mind that with the highly dramatic Egyptian sense of narrative, in none of these massacres of the judiciary was anyone really massacred. The massacre is typically, above all, a removal Rabbi from the official position. So, in the story that I just said now, Senhouri emerges as a hero, as a man who, in 1954, stood on the side of liberal legality, stood on the side of democracy, broke ranks with Nasser, allied himself with Mohammed Naguib and the rest of the free officers who had launched the military coup of 1952, stood with them in the sense of supporting democracy, and lost, and paid the price for it, right? So this is Senhouri, the hero. And that is the story that I was personally raised with. Our house, where I was raised in Giza, is right in front of this lovely building, and coming from a legal family, it has been very typical that every Friday when you sit down over lunch with the family, eventually the conversation turns into how the rule of law was at its height before the military coup of 1952, and where we have arrived today, whether in terms of the loss of prestige of the legal profession or the loss of faith in the rule of law in general. So it's a nostalgic, sad story where Senhouri is a hero. Eventually, when I got to law school, I discovered that there is another story. That Senhouri, the hero, who was beat up for his support of democracy in 1954, actually for the 2 years before that, extended all kinds of legal support to the military regime that launched the revolt or the military coup in 1952. And I'll give you the details of that, but the first question that I would like to address in our talk is, why and how is it that a man who in 1954 stood with democracy, with rule of law fundamentally, 2 years before, and for an extension of time during these 2 years, extended all kinds of legal support to the military that broke all basic ideas of the rule of law? Why is it that that happened? And two, how does this connect to the situation that we have in Egypt today? Where, as some of you might know, the revolution in Egypt, more than the revolutions in any of the rest of the countries of the Arab Spring, and I have to do this now, as typical as this, the revolution in Egypt has taken a decidedly legalistic turn, in the sense that most of our battles in Egypt today, the revolutionary battles, are fought at court. And the slogans that relate to the rule of law are increasingly experienced by revolutionary powers as counter-revolutionary slogans. So when you say, I want the rule of law, I want independence of judiciary, you fundamentally sound like someone who is a reactionary defender of Mubarak or the regime that existed before. So these are two basic questions that I hope to present, and then we can have a conversation. And to present them, I have to give you a very reduced summary of the last 60 years of modern Egyptian history, read through the eyes of a lawyer. Okay, so In 1954, a week before Sanhuri got beat up with a shoe on the steps of Majlis al-Dawla, this was the cover of Al-Musawwar magazine, a weekly popular magazine in Egypt, and the cartoon is very telling. You have in the middle the constitution, Dustur, and it is held on one hand by Nasser, on the other hand by Muhammad Naguib. Muhammad Naguib is the figurative head of the military coup. In front of it is Salah Salim, another member of the three officers who launched the military coup, throwing flower petals as if we are in a wedding procession. And behind them, with the symbols, is Sanhuri. And behind Sanhuri, holding this stick, is Suleiman Hafiz, who was also a judge with Sanhuri in Majlis al-Dawla. The idea back then in '54 was that Egypt was about to embark on a new liberal experiment. We were about to have our new constitution. The new constitution was going to declare Egypt as a parliamentary republic. The army was going to go back to its barracks. Political parties were going to be released again, and so on. Now, unfortunately, none of that happened. A week later, half of the people in this picture were put under arrest. Nasser eventually took over power, and the liberal experiment in Egypt basically ended for 60 years until the revolutions of 2011. This picture shows to what extent there was an amount of support, or at least good relations between Nasser and Sanhuri right before the attack, a week before the attack. Why were there such good relations? Well, I'm gonna have to go here. The military coup takes place in 23 July 1952, and immediately Egypt is lunged into a constitutional crisis. The king abdicates, takes a boat, goes to Capri, and lives his life there. And the king has an infant son who is barely 6 months old, Ahmed Fuad Thani, or Ahmed Fuad II. And under the Egyptian constitution, any king who takes over power must, before assuming his powers, provide an oath of allegiance to respect the constitution. The oath is expected to be given before an elected parliament, right? Parliament at that point had been suspended, both its chambers, and following the constitution and demanding parliament to return again to hear the oath of allegiance would have meant that Al-Wafd, the majority party in Egypt before the military coup, would have returned back to its seats in parliament. This tradition of the king swearing to respect the constitution before assuming his powers is one of the basic liberal victories of the 1923 constitution in Egypt. It's what allowed Egypt between 23 and 52 to limit the powers of the king until the king would reign but not rule, or yamluk wa la yahkum, according to the Egyptian side. So when Farouk, for example, became the king of Egypt in 1937, he had to go to parliament. This is the invitation to hear the king give his oath to pledge allegiance to the constitution. This is King Farouk in his very youth, sitting before parliament with the royal family on his left, the cabinet on his right, members of parliament in front of him, and he stood up there and swore to uphold the constitution, and the members of his royal family, his mother and sisters in the cabinet up there, attending the ceremony. So that was a pretty established tradition, and the expectation was that that would be repeated when he abdicated. When he abdicated, again, he abdicated in favor of a son who was 6 months old. This is a stamp that was issued in January '52 when Farouk's son was born. And a reading of the constitution would have said the regents for that young son would have to swear allegiance before parliament. Parliament suspended. Do we call parliament back or not? The military revolt is July 23. July 31st, 1952, meaning 1 week exactly after the military coup, Sanhouri from the Conseil d'Etat issued a fatwa, or a legal opinion, not of the Islamic variety that we keep on hearing about today of cutting heads and so on, but a fatwa in the modern sense that is still used in Egyptian legal terminology, issued a fatwa stating that actually Parliament does not need to convene and the regents can swear allegiance before the cabinet and not the Parliament. There was a 6-hour meeting of the Conseil d'Etat members of the Fatwa Committee, or the Legal Opinions Committee, in which everyone supported this view except for one courageous member of the committee, Dr. Wahid Rafat. Too much information, but his name needs to be said. If you look at the minutes of the 6-hour meeting, it is stunning to see how you have 7 lawyers / judges supporting one interpretation, and the man valiantly for an hour just speaking over and again that this would be a breach of law, we are in a state of emergency, this is a military coup, And the result, the fatwa came out a week after the military coup with Sanhouri's support. It stopped the parliament from reconvening. It had the regents swear allegiance before a cabinet that is effectively appointed by the military. So basically the regents are swearing before the military. And then a series of other opinions or legal fatwas emerged from the Conseil d'Etat with the support of Sanhouri. So political parties in Egypt between 52 and 54 were banned based on a fatwa from the Conseil d'Etat. Labor unions were all abolished based on a fatwa from the Conseil d'Etat. Attacking any legal opinion or legal action of the military before the Conseil d'Etat was banned, also according to a fatwa by the Conseil d'Etat. Social organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood or the communist parties were banned, also according to a fatwa by the Conseil d'Etat, and so on. So basically between 52 and 54, you have the military ruling on the one side, and you have a coterie of Egypt's legal elite from its most important court, head by its most important judge, Sanhouri, issuing one fatwa after the other, protecting all actions of the military from judicial review, right? Until we reach 1954. So, the first question that I wanted to ask, why would someone like Sanhouri, the paragon of the rule of law in Egypt and the Arab world, the greatest Arab jurist, the man whose tome on the civil code must exist in the office of any self-respecting Arab lawyer in any cabinet d'avocat or legal office across Morocco to Bahrain. Why would a man like that, whose name is associated with the rule of law, who comes across today as a hero, would spend 2 years supporting the military and breaking everything that has to do with the rule of law? The typical interpretation that we have is that Sanhouri, before the military coup, was basically fed up with liberalism. So images of Carl Schmitt's critique of liberal legality and the limits of liberal legality do come across, and we can discuss that further when I finish. But there was a sense that the liberal elite of Egypt, which was fundamentally a legal elite before 1952, had just failed at ruling the country. This is another caricature that also, this is barely 5 months before the military coup, so this is January 1952. In January 1952, Cairo was set aflame. Again, a highly dramatic term. Cairo was not really set aflame, but there is the Cairo fire that took place then. And the cover of the magazine then shows members of the legal elite, instead of actually working on إخماد الحريق, on putting out the fire, thank you, fighting amongst themselves. So you have Nahas, you have Suraj al-Din, you have al-Hilali, and all of them are lawyers, of course. So there was that sense that the legal elite and the ruling elite had failed under the liberal experiment, and that what we needed was a removal of them all. Yeah? And of course, that that ruling elite was fundamentally a legal elite. And that's what takes us to this book, This Rise and Fall of the Elite. That elite emerged early 19th century. By the late 19th century, they had become very much an elite in the widest sense of the term, not only as ministers or major functionaries of the state, but also as journalists, as novelists, as artists, as painters. Those who are trained in the legal field in Egypt until 1952 were effectively a ruling elite in the widest sense that you can imagine. The most important newspapers were owned by lawyers and so on, even if they were not practicing lawyers. And so the sense that lawyers with a commitment to the rule of law were responsible for the problems of Egypt in 1952 was very palpable, especially when you look at this image. And so the typical explanation of why did Senghuri support all these illiberal measures was a loss of faith in liberalism, right? Along with it is another interpretation, which is he had also lost faith in Al-Wafd, the ruling party in Egypt, the majority party in Egypt. If we think of India and the Congress party in India, then Al-Wafd would be the equivalent of the Congress in Egypt. And he had gone into various feuds with them, eventually broke ranks with the party, established his own party, and so on. And so there is another interpretation that the reason Senghuri allowed for all these illegal measures to happen is that he was settling scores with the party. These are all reasonable explanations, but to my mind, they are not enough, in the sense that they paper over a much deeper contradiction of liberalism and revolution, or the role of lawyers in revolution, or how much lawyers can be supportive of revolution. So Senghuri may have wanted to settle scores. Senghuri may have been fed up with old ruling elites, but something deeper, I believe, was at stake. A sense that actually at moments of revolution, lawyers and liberal legality often are the enemy. Hence, Henry VI's line, first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Now, of course, lawyers have two interpretations of that line. One interpretation is lawyers are the ones who support the old regime. Lawyers are the protectors of financial interests, political interests of the old elite. If a revolution is really ever going to succeed, then the first thing we do, we ought to kill all the lawyers. Another interpretation of it, and you must, raise your hats to lawyers' ability to actually split hairs, and even with this clear Shakespearean line against lawyers, come up with another interpretation, contradictory one. And in that case, it is that lawyers at revolutions are the last defending line against a Jacobin destruction of everything that is sacred and holy, fundamentally property rights and freedom of expression, or minority rights. So first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers, important because revolution must succeed. Or first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers, important because we must be able to remove the property rights or the defenders of minority rights or the defenders of public opinion. I'll leave this contradiction on the side now and we can discuss it more and continue with what happened after 54. These are some newspapers from that moment. And what's interesting about these newspapers is that those who have been following the events in Egypt after the revolution, one of the typical slogans after January 25th has been الجيش والشعب إيد واحدة, or the people and the army are one hand. And what's stunning here is you have something similar, الجيش والشعب جبهة واحدة. This is 54. The newspaper before promises, right before Senghuri's beat up, promises the return of political parties and so on. Now, none of that happened. And what happened instead in 54, or post-54, is the abolition of all political parties, the abolition of all labor unions, the creation of one-party system. Starts off with Jabhat al-Tahrir, or the Liberation Rally, followed afterwards with the Arab Socialist Union under Nasser, followed afterwards with Hizb al-Watan al-Demokrati, the National Democratic Party, under Sadat, leading up to Mubarak. So the opening of the one-party system under which Egypt was ruled for the last 60 years. the abolition again of all independent labor unions or professional syndicates, the lawyer syndicate, the engineer syndicate, and so on, and the emergence of a new crisis. And I'll do this very quickly, and then we can open our conversation. In the 60 years of the July system, under which we have been ruled, and against which the regime, or against which the slogan of Isqat al-Nizam, or bringing the system down, was raised, can be divided into two moments. There is the moment of Nasser, which emerges from 54 to 70, and then there's another moment from 70 until 2011, which is Sadat and Mubarak. The two systems share a similar logic in the sense that the regime, at its heart, at its core, is a military regime. All our presidents have come from the army. Throughout these 60 years, the army has become a state within a state. An economy so large that you have statistics, if you do any research on it, some of which claiming that the army is responsible for up to 40% of Egypt's GDP. The army produces macaroni, the army produces tomatoes, the army has a construction company that creates public roads, the army has gas stations, the army has supermarkets, the army has chicken coops, the army has a million things. However, unlike other clearly militaristic regimes, this regime, this July regime, which has a military core, has never presented itself openly as a military regime, right? Unlike moments in Pakistan, for example. To the contrary, because the ruling elite in Egypt, until 52, have been a decidedly legal elite, and a very strong legal elite, the army continued to present itself as, or the ruling regime continued to present itself as a civilian regime. So you have a military core, the ruling elite is fundamentally from the army, but the veneer is a civilian veneer. So Nasser took off his military suit in 1956, put on a civilian suit, and since then, every president of Egypt who has come from the army has always worn a military, a civilian suit. With, entre parenthèses, between brackets, Sadat, who had a minor panache for wearing military suits at parades, and eventually was assassinated in one of them. But, with that minor exception, the regime constantly presented itself as a civilian system, as a civil system that is committed to the rule of law, a civil system that is committed to the independence of the judiciary, all the slogans that we associate with it. However, in the period under Nasser, there was an open critique of liberalism, which is stunning to read today. Yes, and another quick. Post-1954, Nasser has gotten rid of all the opposition parties in Egypt, all the labor unions. There is nothing left basically in the country except the communists and the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is a cover of the same magazine. This is late 1954. Nasser holding a stick, looking at this double-edged headed animal. One head is the communists, the other head is the Brotherhood. He's unsure which to strike first. Eventually he strikes both, and by the end of 54, the political scene in Egypt is basically empty, in the sense that there is no formal political parties or social groupings that can be rallied in support of the rulers. That presented the regime with a problem. If you want support on the street, if you want to get people to support your measures, there has to be some organization that can rally the people to express support for the regime. The solution to that under Nasser was the creation of the one-party system, but the creation of the one-party system from 54 to 70, with a clear logic of critiquing liberalism. So Nasser has these wonderful critiques that you can read in Arabic if you can, until this thing gets translated into English, in which he says that democracy is a sham, democracy is nothing but a facade for capitalist interests. He was asked after the revolution whether Egypt should not establish two political parties, a left and the right, and the two should compete with each other. And then he answered back that actually there is no freedom politically until people have the freedom to eat, حرية لقمة العيش, or the freedom of bread, literally, which is one of the slogans of the January 25 revolution. He critiqued the democracy or the liberal experiment in Egypt before the military coup as, again, a sham. Whether you elect this party or that party, both parties in the end are protecting the same capitalist interests, and therefore he has no interest in establishing a new political party or having a multi-party system. A multi-party system is a sham. What we need first is a radical redistribution of wealth among Egyptians, and then maybe the power to vote might mean something. Until then, the power to vote is nothing. It's a very appealing logic. We can discuss this furthermore, but of course it's also a logic that opened up the road to despotism in Egypt under Nasser. His solution instead was to create a single party, Arab Socialist Union, committed to that logic of liberalism is a sham, Western democracies are not real democracies, and so on. Created the Arab Socialist Union. Within 3 weeks of establishing the union, 5 million Egyptians had already enlisted as members of that party. Okay? And they were required to write a new constitution. And this is the cover of what that new constitution might have looked like. Unfortunately, that cover and that book came out barely 3 months before the defeat of 1967, the Six-Day War. Right? So the experiment ended with that. These are some pictures of Nasser trying to rally support for the constitution, and then eventually 1969. So the defeat is 67. In that process leading up to the defeat, everyone has become a member of the Arab Socialist Union. All social organizations have become members, engineers, lawyers, doctors, and so on. And the only social group in Egypt that had not joined the Arab Socialist Union were the judges. And the judges had taken a very clear stance that we will not be politicized. We are neutral, we do not join political parties. That was leading to a clash between Nasser and the judges. The 67 defeat happened, that postponed the clash. And then in March 68, the Judges Club issued a statement in which it claimed that the absence of the rule of law in Egypt was responsible for the 67 defeat, and that what we need is a reinstatement of all the commitments to the rule of law that we have lost after the military defeat. Nasser's representatives pleaded with the Judges Club to wait and not issue that statement because Nasser was about to issue another statement in 68. Bayan Maris 68, or the March 68 communique, in which he was going to express actually that the failure of the rule of law was responsible for the defeat and that he was planning to take measures to improve the situation, and that when the judges issued their statement before him, Nasser was made to look as if he was not taking the initiative to fix the situation, but rather was being pushed into it by the judges. That created a very bad relationship between Nasser and the Judges Club, which culminated in 69 with the second massacre of the judiciary, in which, again, no one was massacred. But 180 judges approximately were removed from their positions. Some were retired, some were shifted to administrative jobs. And then Nasser died, barely 2 years after that. And what we got was Sadat. And that takes us to the second stage in the history of this regime that we demand to, or the people demand to bring down. Sadat took a major turn from Nasser to distinguish the regime from Nasser's moment by openly adopting rule of law slogans in two directions. On the one hand, in the direction of the economy. So instead of the socialist economy that Egypt had before Sadat adopted al-infitah, or the open door policy, so openly accepting capitalism again, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a commitment to liberalism by committing to independence of the judiciary and the protection of the civil rights of Egyptians, as opposed to the oppressive regime under Nasser, in which the government would wiretap people's phones and so on. And in highly dramatic fashion, which Sadat was famous for, you get images of Sadat, for example, in this image here, in the entrance of the Ministry of Interior, personally burning down the recordings of the Ministry of Interior against Egyptians who were under wiretap by the government. or later on in 1975, personally destroying one of the political prison cells in which Nasser's political enemies were arrested. However, despite these, perfunctory measures of confirming the rule of law, the regime continued fundamentally the same. The ruling elite at core were military, the veneer on the outside was civilian, and the regime, what that meant, was capable of performing mini coups on itself every time it needed to pass a certain measure that broke with the rule of law. Now, that meant that Egypt, over the last 60 years, has been ruled under a state of emergency for almost 55 years. Intermittently, but the total is 60 years, of them 55 years under Rabbi emergency law. What emergency law does is it allows you to refer cases outside of civilian courts and give them to judges whose decision is pretty much established before the case even starts. The same system continued with Mubarak, and this is where I'm going to end. The commitment to an open market or a capitalist market continued, and then we went through various stages of economic liberalization, particularly after the 1991 US-led war to liberate Iraq, in which Egypt participated and was paid handsomely for it. Half of our national loans were relieved, and in return, Egypt committed to a set of economic reforms that are the basic staple of a neoliberal turn in the economy. That was the first turn, 91. Neoliberalization continued pretty much until 2005, which is where this book ends. In 2005, the contradictions of this regime that maintains a military core but pretends to be a civilian regime on its outset fundamentally just came crumbling down under the weight of these contradictions, to my mind. And the crumbling came under the rise of the Judges Club again. So we were having elections. Judges were required to supervise every single ballot box according to a new court decision. The judges decided that they will not supervise the elections unless serious reforms were taken to ensure the independence of the judiciary. The regime gave them something, left something else, and the judges in the end succumbed and actually supervised the elections. But then you can, to my mind, start counting from 2005 until the present, these 7 years, 6 years, the slow spiraling down of the system until we reach January 25. And that slow spiraling down includes, of course, the Judges Club rebellion, but also the strikes of labor unions in Mahalla, the strikes of student movements during the Iraq war invasion, and so on, which I can leave for further discussion. Now, to close. Today, Egypt, after the revolution of January 25th, has at its helm a number of ruling elites who come from the same liberal legal elite, judges, almost all of whom were associated with the stream of the independence of the judiciary back from 2005. The Minister of Justice was one of the figureheads of the independence of the judiciary in 2005. I personally, in 2005, along with many friends, camped outside the Judges Club in support of the judges. We thought were our only option for reform in Egypt. The the head of the Human Rights Council also belongs to the same stream that headed the Judges Club back then and is a figure of independence of judiciary. The vice president, also a figure of that stream, and so on. These people are our ruling elite today. And these people today, surprisingly, if you ask members of what one would, at least in my mind, describe as revolutionary forces in Egypt, would describe these past revolutionaries of 2005 as counter-revolutionary, as reactionaries, as people who are supporting the demise of the democratic turn in Egypt. In a very clear sense, they take us back again to Senghuri in 52 to 54. They have been allowing the issuing of a constitution. We just got a constitution, as you know, the end of last year, a constitution that is riddled with procedural and substantive problems, and they presided over it. They have proceeded to ignore one court decision after the other against members of the cabinet. And they have provided the same kind of legal support to the Muslim Brotherhood president and cabinet today that Senhouri back in 52 to 54 provided to the army. Now, if we simply refuse to dismiss Senhouri's support for the army back between 52 and 54 as just a petty settling of scores with the army, then we might also be forced to dismiss interpretations of these folks today as just sellouts who are after political power. Something more must be at stake, to my mind. Many of these judges are people that one has deep respect for because at critical moments between 2005 and 2007, they really were at the helm of opposition to Mubarak. Now, how do you explain that folks like these back then turn today into what they are, which is basically an embodiment of Shakespearean desire to kill all the lawyers? How do you explain that without descending into petty or, to my mind, simplistic interpretations of they were just corrupted by power, or power corrupts, or once you are in a position of power, you stop actually having the revolutionary loyalties that you have? The problem might be something about the composition of lawyers themselves. It might be about the conservative ideology of lawyers. It might be about the counter-revolutionary impulse that the profession generally has. I don't know. But such is our history, and such is where we stand now. And such is, surprisingly, the continuing importance of the legal elite for 200 years. Thank you very much. Sorry, this took too long in a very horsey voice. I apologize. Nukhet.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, your presence and this is an amazing story. I look forward to hearing and reading more about it. My question, one of my questions and one I will pose is, what has been the relationship of this legal elite with the religious elite throughout your story, and has it changed in any way? And I'm talking about, well, of course, it's intertwined, like political religious and scholarly religious, but I'm more interested in the scholarly part.
And I see Turkey lurking behind your question. Bishara, do you want me to answer immediately, or do you want me to collect questions?
Collect a couple of questions.
Should we do that? Okay.
Up to you.
Bishara.
So, one is just a content kind of question. What happened between 54 and 62? Because 62 is when the one-state system was put in place. So there were several years in between in which was a no man's land, so to speak. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. That might have something to do with how that legal profession got used to its new position. The other is similar to the guest question in the sense of relationship between this legal elite and other segments of society. That is to say, what would be a political angle to the answer? Rule of law and kind of a liberal political system only can take you so far. Nasser did say something that resonated at that time, which is something that many people in this country feel today with Democrats and Republicans. I mean, there's an old Arabic saying that says there are two asses in one underwear.
تزين في الباس.
So that criticism you can hear it here all the time as well. And so did the lawyers or the legal elite in Egypt during this period develop certain alliances and connections with business people, with certain sectors of the economy, et cetera, because it was a mixed economy. Some things were nationalized and some things remained private. That might help explain the position.
Brilliant. That actually opens up. Brilliant. Okay. Let me take the two questions first. So, the religious elite. One thing to note today, after the revolution, it's very common if you're reading the New York Times or The Economist to see a new vocabulary settling in and describing the political scene in Egypt today. You have the Islamists and you have the liberals, right? To my mind, that distinction between the Islamists and the liberals is an intellectually, quite frankly, dumb and a politically dangerous language to adopt. Intellectually dumb because the Islamists and the liberals are both liberals. The liberals not in the sense of being socially progressive, in the sense of supporting gay marriage. That's not where we're at all. But they are liberal in the classical European sense, continental sense of liberal, in the sense that they use the same language of liberal legality. They use the language of individual rights. They are all in agreement about slogans such as separation of powers, independence of the judiciary, having rights encapsulated in a constitution, having a Supreme Court that exercises judicial review over these rights, and so on. Everything that we take together today as the basic vocabulary of liberal legality. And so the Islamists and the liberals are liberals. Perhaps the only minor outlying exception would be the Salafists, or extreme right, but even the Salafists over the last couple of years have increasingly come to play the same liberal game, to use the same liberal terms. So liberals versus Islamists just intellectually does not make sense. And then it is politically dangerous because it obfuscates the distributional stakes that are present when we are discussing these terms. So instead of saying liberals and Islamists, one should be saying left and right. One should be saying people into public property or redistribution or the commons or whatever term we would use for a redistribution of wealth or power in Egypt, versus a conservative take on the economy. The Muslim Brotherhood, which rules Egypt today, if you read the program, the economic program for the elections that we've just had, their economic program is more neoliberal than the program of Gamal Mubarak, the son of Hosni Mubarak. They are far more actually in line with what the World Bank would want us to do than actually were the sons or the Politburo of the ruling party. So economically, they're just as liberal, if not more. However, their slogan is and has been Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the solution. So there has to be some veneer of the Islamic, which has emerged certainly after the revolution. But surprisingly, it is not leading to an alliance, but rather frictures with the old religious elite, which is fundamentally the Azhar. So our new constitution has a new article, Article 4. Article 4 states explicitly that all laws that have an Islamic law implication must be reviewed by Al-Azhar before they are passed. The language is, with all beautifully drafted legal language, iffy, interpretable this way or that. Unclear whether Azhar's opinion is binding or not. This was one of the answers. But then it's very clear that if you submit a law to Al-Azhar, and Al-Azhar says, no, this is un-Islamic, I mean, realistically speaking, you're going to have to follow Al-Azhar's line. I mean, you cannot go against Al-Azhar and say, screw you, Azhar, no, you'll pass it even if you say it's un-Islamic. So effectively, the article creates Al-Azhar as a space for judicial review. Creates specifically Hay'at Kibar Ulama Al-Azhar, the senior Azhar jurist committee, as the judicial review, which means that we have now two high courts, one in Al-Azhar and one in the state secular judiciary. This has not led to a honeymoon between the Muslim Brotherhood government and the Brotherhood. To the contrary, a month ago, the government, as you might know, Egypt is going bankrupt by the second. Right? We spent all our foreign reserves. We've been begging money from Qatar. We've been begging money from Libya. Just gave us $2 billion, and so on. And the money that we're being given is not really loans. It's deposits in the central bank. It's even worse. As a solution to that, the government decided to issue sukuk Islamiyya, or Islamic bonds. You look at these Islamic bonds, and there's nothing Islamic about the bonds except the prefix Islamic. The government passed the bonds through the Senate without passing the legislation by Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar got riled up and angry, It became clear that the bonds are going to be declared unconstitutional, so the bonds law was passed to Al-Azhar, and Al-Azhar struck it down as un-Islamic. So the relationship between them is unclear so far. But historically, the relationship is clear. The rise of the new elite Egyptian lawyers from 1882 onwards had been at the cost of the old Azharite elites. And you see it in the history of many of the nationalist figures in Egypt. So Saad Basha Zaghloul, the hero of Egyptian nationalism until 1919, and he started off studying at Al-Azhar and then shifted to the Khedive Law School. Mustafa Basha Kamil, the hero of national politics in Egypt in the beginning of the 20th century, also started at Al-Azhar and then shifted to Cairo Law School, and so on. So there was a clear sense by the ruling elite families that if you want your kid to move on socially, you don't send him to Al-Azhar anymore. You send him to the new elite secular law schools. So there is an element of the return of the repressed that's happening there, but the repressed that is returning is not the repressed of the late 19th century. They have just become as liberal as everyone else. Al-Azhar issued, after the revolution, 2 documents, one on political rights, another one on the form of government. And you go through the 2 documents, and they just look like the declarations of the rights of man and citizen that came out of the French Revolution. And the language is liberal. The language is incredibly liberal. Again, not in socially progressive, but liberal in the sense of, I have my right, you have your right, my right ends where your right starts, just basic centrist liberal jargon, right? How it's going to play out in the future. 52 to 62, to answer Bashar. One of the biggest disasters that the regime or the military coup had for the Egyptian legal elite is that it robbed them of their main clients. So lawyers were rich because they had rich clients, because they were fundamentally big land estates. These land estates were nationalized, sequestrated, redistributed in various forms, and lawyers ended up losing their clients and ended up joining, if you want to maintain elite status, according to what Bashar is asking, then you join government. Then you join government service. You join one of the emerging government organizations, الهيئة العربية للتصنيع, the Arab Industrialization Association. And you become a lawyer there, or you become a lawyer in one of the ministries. The shift that happens with Sadat and then Mubarak is a return of lawyers fundamentally because of the opening up of the economy again. So the opening up of the economy, the turn back again to capitalism, allows big companies to return, so allows corporate law firms to open up again in Egypt, allows multinational corporate law firms to open in Egypt, which had not happened until, from the 60s to the 90s. It also allows human rights lawyers, which is a very new breed in Egypt, to emerge from the 80s onwards. They're not called human rights lawyers in the 80s. The term is still unclear. The profession is not settled then. By now, it is clear. You have a very clear number of human rights organizations that play a very important and vocal role in settling public policy concerns or in debate today. That was not present under Nasser's situation. That is certainly the case today. And of course, the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood legal elite, which is a separate legal elite, also liberal in the sense of its total acceptance of the vocabulary of liberal legality, the discourse of rights and so on, but it's far more organized than it was before Nasser. So the shift from Nasser to Sadat/Mubarak has allowed a return of lawyers again to the center stage, but in different ways. And the ones who seem to be succeeding now are the Muslim Brotherhood lawyers, quite frankly. I don't know if that answers the question.
What it tells me is that the landed elite gave these lawyers a certain degree of autonomy from the new regime that came in, but with the land reform programs of 54 and 61, then they got tied into government, for the most part, government services.
Yeah.
Hence their peace and quiet. But then with the opening, Iftitah of Sadat, tied to multinational corporations and neoliberal, that explains the position now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. There is that. There is something also, if I may quickly, there is also the fall in the prestige of the legal profession. So Before 1952, the Faculty of Law used to be called كلية الوزراء, or the Faculty of Ministers, just because of the inordinate number of graduates of the school who manned Egyptian ministries or were members of the elite. Today, the Faculty of Law at Cairo University, which I graduated from, is called Garage El-Gam'a, the university garage. It's where basically students who could not get admitted anywhere else are parked like an old useless car to await graduation. We have 36,000 students at Cairo University Faculty of Law alone. This is not America. This is Egypt, in which actually choosing a legal career is not an upwardly mobile route towards elite status at all. To marry your daughter or your son to a lawyer is horrible. I mean, you wouldn't wish it upon your enemy. It's just terrible. When I applied to law school, it was a disaster. You know, I had a good grades. You apply through the central system. There is a man sitting at the central university admissions office who receives your application, and he looked at my grades and looked at my choices of schools that I want to join, and it was, the various law schools in the country and then one of the elite schools. And the man had me go back again to the end of the line to reconsider my clearly crazy choice and then decide. So that is the other thing that has happened. The status of legal education in Egypt has gone down the drain. Of course, the quality of legal education has also gone down the drain. The quality of intellectual production related to law is dismal. We have a huge number of doctors, or PhDs. Almost the entire cabinet today in Egypt are PhDs of one form or the other, including our lovely president, who did his PhD here in the States, and who until now is incapable of speaking proper English, as you may have seen, which makes us wonder about the quality of how we give PhDs here in the States. Not saying anything about Brown, he went somewhere in the Midwest, but... and then, of course, there is the legal profession, the Bar Association. The Bar Association used to be an incredibly powerful organization. The Bar Association now has a humongous number of members, most of whom happen to be taxi drivers, petty merchants, people working in shops, what have you. They're not lawyers. So the legal profession has collapsed. The Bar Association has collapsed. The universities have collapsed. The quality of intellectual production of law has collapsed. And then we have the judiciary. And the judiciary has prided itself as the only remaining bastion of professionalism in the country. But following the news, you could just see clearly how the judiciary has been also infiltrated by the regime from the 1960s onwards. Elias, sorry, and then.
I'd love to talk.
Thank you.
Because I love how seriously you take the question of how liberal actors, people who are acting in this, in these very real contexts, why they make the choices they make, instead of just kind of dismissing it summarily in this sort of naive and this sort of cynical way. Well, of course, they're co-opted by the system or they're whatever. And I think that this question that you're asking that you did not actually answer is extensible to a lot of the contexts we see today, where in many of these national contexts where we see revolutionary activity, there are examples of people who pre-revolution were regarded as major reformers and sort of proponents of major change, and who were well-spoken and immensely learned and were the darlings of international media and diasporas, who after things changed became more accommodationist, and you could name lots of different people like this. So, and I just wonder if maybe if we're going to take them seriously as you say, like real intellectuals and individuals whose actions should be thought about carefully, I wonder if we shouldn't just remember that they are also political actors, and if in the case of Egypt, the 2005 decision about the elections, if they weren't thinking back to the earlier massacre of the judiciary in 1968, where when they did go up against Nasser and say, no, we're going to hold our ground, they were summarily dismissed. And so maybe if they're thinking a little bit more cynically about maintaining their own foothold within the halls of power, kind of more accommodationist stance.
A strategic or utilitarian calculating of the position in order to maintain oneself in it to oppose in the future?
Which also sounds very simplistic and cynical.
No, it's not.
But I wonder if it's, one dimension or of this larger picture. Because I agree. I think about, in other contexts as well. I wonder, like, this person was the voice of XYZ, liberal, all these different values. I've seen these kinds of characters confronted by their former supporters in press conferences saying, we supported you and you are now a minister and you could have done so much and you're the worst possible example now. We had such high hopes for you, So I'm curious about if you've thought, if there's a way of kind of proposing an answer for why we see these flips.
So that explanation is definitely makes sense. Definitely makes sense. And just building on it, in 2005, when there were groups of us camped outside the Judges Club and supporting them, and then people were arrested and beat up and taken to hospital, the members of the Judges Club that we were camping outside to support refused to actually go to the hospital to see their people who were there supporting them, and perform what is the most basic, polite thing that you should perform as an Egyptian social actor, which is you go and visit the man or the woman who was supporting you in the hospital, having been beaten up outside your club. And their line was, no, that would be too political. We cannot go and visit them. And the response then was one of, my God, I hate you so much, you bloody traitors. This is just a preview of what's going to happen 7 years later. And the other sense was exactly what you're saying. Well, they need to maintain some relationship to the regime. They need to maintain some ability to stay within the Judges Club and to stay within the judiciary in order to maybe fight another battle in the future. So that's totally one interpretation, absolutely. The other one has to do with liberalism as an ideology, I think, and the contradictions of liberalism as an ideology. And I haven't thought out that through fully with these folks, but there's just a fundamental contradiction between, on the one hand, protecting individual rights, and then on the other hand, saying, I'm into democracy. I mean, the individual is the major counting unit for liberal legality. The demos, or the people, are the major counting unit for democracy. And the two must intellectually and in reality clash with each other, and have historically clashed. So we have had liberalism in Europe way long before we've had democracy. France, England, Germany, Italy, all of these had liberal legal systems well into the 20th century, but not democracies. And lawyers could perform their role as liberal or defenders of liberalism without having to also perform their roles as protectors of democracy. It's only in the 20th century onwards when suddenly liberalism and democracy came to be conjoined together, and we have this, hyphenated regimes of liberal and democratic, did the fundamental contradiction between liberalism and democracy on one hand, to my mind, emerge. And maybe that's another way of explaining it. It's a bit too theoretical and needs to be fleshed out, but I feel that many of them are happy with liberalism but not with democracy. Just as many elites in Italy or France or England, well into the 20th century, were happy with liberalism but not with democracy. Or the state, I mean, for God's sake. I don't know the answers. But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. I learned quite a bit, so I'm not sure if this is going to be useful.
I think we have to remove Mubarak from the screen first before we cannot have the bloody man just in our face constantly. Let's instead have 23 July.
These are just maybe going to be some clarification questions, maybe. And one of them was, I was really curious about if maybe you can tell us a couple of, maybe there's some examples, maybe at the local level of what the pre-existing political arrangements were in the region before liberalism as an ideology takes hold, and then in the 19th century and then in the 20th century when liberal democracy as an ideology takes hold, and particularly alternatives that were maybe suggested in the 50s and 60s during those kinds of the massacres of the judiciary. And for so many indigenous people, when liberalism and liberal democracy becomes thrust on them, it's so distinct from arrangements of consensus, arrangements where political classes do not exist, where people actually take turns governing. And when I think about the clash between the judiciary and politicians, or I guess the military regime, it seems that those contradictions exist, but they seem to be false contradictions or these antagonisms because they're really political classes more than they are two distinct bodies. It seems to be that they are kind of upholding a relation of power, of domination over people, right? So I wonder if you can maybe tell us if maybe we can learn from pre-existing political arrangements or proposed alternatives to see if this was consciously on the minds of people who were critiquing liberal democracy during the massacre.
Okay. So a quick answer, no. This was not on the minds of people critiquing liberal democracy during Nasser's time because the impression is that before 52, or even, I hate to speak when we have, Mamluk scholars here, and so the most that I can go back to is, the Ottoman period. And the Ottoman period is typically reflected or discussed in Egyptian and Arab historiography as in terms of what is called the wasteland theory, in the sense that, 300 years of nothing happening, of despotism, of Egypt and the rest of the Arab world was a wasteland under the Ottomans. Now, many scholars have come to seriously contest that theory and prove otherwise, but the ruling regime in Egypt continued, and until now, if you look at the curriculum of an Egyptian public Ministry of Education, or a Syrian, or a Palestinian, you find the same wasteland theory there. So there is no harking back to a moment where it was, unless you talk about the community of Medina, Mujtama al-Medina, unless you talk about the very short period in which the Prophet existed in Medina, and then the four caliphs under him, after him, as a moment of consensus, as a moment of ruling with another system in mind. Of course, the problem with that thesis is that all of these four caliphs were assassinated. So the idea that this was a golden age, to my mind, is very strange. I don't understand why is that system so glorified if the rulers of, except for the Prophet, the rulers of that golden moment were all killed, politically assassinated. So, aside from that and the Ottoman period, we get to the 19th century. Liberalism thrust upon us. One thesis about what happened in Egypt in the late 19th century, with a turn to liberal legality, is that this was imposed on Egypt by British colonialism. Right? So Egypt was occupied by Britain in 1882. The major legal reforms that happened in Egypt were 1876 and then 1883. The dates just conjoined too closely with Egypt becoming a British colony that it's easy to assume that the reforms happened because the British forced them on us. Another interpretation that is much more convincing to my mind is that actually this emerging new elite of lawyers actually wanted liberal legality, because liberal legality put restraints on the Khedive, the king, the ruler, on the one hand, and then when the British came in, it also put restraints on the powers of the British to rule without any constraints. So instead of liberalism being something that is forced on Egypt at the expense of removing or losing our Islamic national identity, a more convincing theory is that Egypt, an emerging set of Egyptian elites, these folks that we tell the story of, actually consciously worked to have a liberal legal system in order to gain power for themselves, for this new ruling elite, and limit the powers of the king on the one hand, and the emerging powers of the British colonial officers on the other hand. And so courts in Egypt in the 19th and early 20th century become spaces of contestation with the king on the one hand and with the British on the other, in which Egyptian bureaucrats are trying to limit the powers of both. So it's not a tragic story of losing our identity or losing a communal system in favor of a system that was adopted from abroad or imposed on us from abroad, but rather a much more emancipatory story of an elite very consciously manipulating a new system, choosing it to actually expand their powers and limit the authoritarian powers of, and you see it in, you see it in documents, you see it in the memoirs of Nobar Besha, for example, where he's just very open about why is it that we want liberalism or the rule of law. He doesn't want, the khedif to just decide.
Is this the view, though, from the elite still and not the view from below? Would the view from below maybe tell a different story?
The view from below, the more typical one is, yes, the different story. The tragic story of we had Islamic law and then we lost Islamic law and now we want Islamic law back. So that would be the more typical story. That would be the more vulgar, to my mind, more flat, vulgarized version. We had Sharia, we lost Sharia in favor of the systems that were imported from abroad, and these elites played a major role, and now we demand the return of the Sharia. The problem, of course, with that narrative is that the language in which they demand the return of the Sharia is spoken in terms of liberal legality. It's shocking. You hear even the Salafis demanding the return of the Sharia, and the Sharia that they're asking for is a constitution with separation of powers. It's liberalism. And it has nothing to do with the feudal legal order that existed in Egypt until the early 19th century. So we are all liberals today, whether we like it or not. Not socially, but welcome. Chantage.
No, I just have a small question about Schmidt, but I'm not sure if this is where your project is going or not. I was just very struck when you said that Senator Reid had in mind Carl Schmitt's loss of faith in the rule of law, particularly given the moment in which Senhuri was living and writing, and also the moment in which Schmidt was living and writing. And so, as those moments recede in time, I think the philosophy of law that Schmidt sort of articulated has become kind of compelling from a range of views today. But of course, in terms of his intervention in his own historical moment, he was actually a counselor to the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany, and the perhaps equivalent and perhaps even more monstrous historical moment in Germany to the one that you were describing, in which Senhuri is signing coming up with the justification for this initial fatwa that breaks the rule of law, would have been the 1932 Constitutional Court case in which Schmidt is advocating for an expansive interpretation of the Weimar Constitution that ushers in, ultimately, basically a year later, Hitler is Chancellor of Germany. And all of that would have been very much in the very recent past, in 1952 to 1953. So I just find myself very curious about, as compelling as Schmidt's critiques of liberal legality are, the implications of that in terms of the dangers of the Jacobin or the reigns of terror would have been much more immediately pressing, I think, in the consciousnesses of those just post the Second World War. So I just found myself very, very curious about what Senhuri's relationship was to Schmidt.
I don't know. But I know that he had a relationship to jurists here, to the legal realists in America. I know that his dissertation was sent by his supervisor, Edouard Lambert, to Roscoe Pound at Harvard Law School. At the Harvard Law School archives, you find letters between Pound and Lambert discussing Senhuri's thesis. I know that Senhuri was very much into the American legal realists. For those of you who are not lawyers, and you should thank God for that, the American legal realists are a band of jurists emerging from the late 19th century, well into the 30s in the States, who allowed for a veritable revolution in American legal thought, which took American legal thought, on the one hand, from a very individualistic or individual-centered perspective to a more social perspective, but also allowed for sociological insights into legal argument, and had a generally lefty approach, but if pushed to the edge, it also had a nihilistic relationship to law. So it could throw away the baby with the bathwater. It could lead to fascism, basically. And so many of the American legal realists by the 30s were just too scared of where the critiques were taking them. And then the Red Scare was happening and the Second World War was about to start, that they stopped critique and moved into reconstruction. So I know that I know that he has, he openly cites American legal realist heroes. He openly has a critique of transcendental nonsense. So Transcendental Nonsense is an article by Cohen, a major American legal realist from what, the 30s or 20s, 30s, in which he describes formalist legal thought as transcendental nonsense.